conversation pretty interactive, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is
Cool.
that okay?
Yeah.
I can make it not. Okay.
No. However.
Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm so glad that y'all are here today. My name is Isaac Archuleta, and I'm a therapist in Denver, Colorado. And I am really excited about today's conversation, specifically around sex and sexuality, and what we get to do about creating a sexual ethic. I think that as a therapist, there's a really interesting and very important conversation happening in terms of what do we believe as a queer Christian community around specifically what we do with our bodies. Some of us believe that the Bible is inerrant, some of us don't believe that. And depending on the kind of view that we hold around Bible and other religions and their dogmas, we have this wide array of what we do sexually. All the way from the traditional view of no sex before marriage and the monogamy that might include, but all the way to the other end of the spectrum where we're thinking about triads and polyamory and open relationships and having multiple sex partners, not just one-on-one, but individually all at the same time. And I think that this is a really important conversation. So I felt really excited to come and be with y'all here at conference and to present some of this information. Just so everyone can follow along, there is a link in the chat box. And if you can't access it, let me know. I'll send it one more time. But that link should take you to a downloadable PDF. So I made kind of a manual for today with all kinds of images in terms of graphs and different pictures so we can all kind of follow along. And yeah, I love to nerd out about this. So there's a lot of like graphics and charts and things like that. So I want you to be able to have access to them, not only right here, right now, but so that you can download and take it. And thank you. I'm getting comments. I will send it one more time. The link is coming. Try that and let me know. I also want this to be fairly interactive. So if you have any questions, you can raise your hand and that'll direct me to the chat box. And from there, I will interact with y'all. And I want this to almost feel more like a classroom, even though I can't see or hear you. But just raise your hand and I'll pop over to the chat box and we can communicate and interact that way. Yes. So one of the things that I want to start out with, I was once a seminary professor, a co-professor of a class called Sexuality and Counseling. And one of the ways that I started the class, the very first question that I asked was, what makes you straight? Assuming everybody in the class was straight, even though that's probably not a thing. But it was really interesting to see straight people answer my questions and have a lot of confusion on their face. And I think for those of us who are queer, we're more aware of what it is, the particular components that make our sexuality what it is, our attractions, our internal desires, the sensations, and the innocence. I believe that, and we'll get into this a lot, that there's a lot of buckets that drive our sexuality. We'll get into all of that, but I did want to throw out this question, and you can see it kind of on the outline. What is your definition of good sex? Does it have to do with the physical act, or is it more about pleasure, belonging, bonding, fun, recreation, or about soothing a deeper craving? And we'll kind of break down all of that as we go through today, but I kind of want that to be a looming question so that we can kind of prime the pump for you, so we can kind of begin to have a deep dive into what makes your sexuality come alive, and then from there, what we do with that information. Thank you, Dan, for letting me know. If anybody, I will definitely post the PDF one more time. There you go. Let me know if anybody needs it, just raise a hand and I'll be sure to look at the chats. Okay, so what I want y'all to do is I want you to write down 3 things about what you like about falling in love. Another 3 things about what things that make you feel safe with your significant other, or that you hope to experience with your significant other in terms of safety. And let me know what it is that would signify you to know that you have found the right partner. You can just throw some of these up, and I will kind of follow along. I think the link is working, so that's a good thing. If I were going to write down the first things that I like about falling in love, I would say that I like the safety that it provides, maybe more the security that it provides, the joy it provokes, but it also helps me feel like I am living into my relational being, which I feel like is one of the reasons why we're all here. If we're going to think about teleology, or the reason, what the French might say, the raison d'être, why are we here? I would say that one of my biggest reasons, and I think we can look in theology and kind of find similar answers, but we're all made to be in relationships. The things that would make me feel safe with a significant other, honesty, for sure. Deep vulnerability is really, really important to me. Consistency in terms of communication and presence, quality time with one another, and I think being challenged. I like receiving feedback in areas that I can improve upon. So those might be some things that I would say for that. My three things that let me know I have found the right partner, I think they're very similar. Trying to think of Joe, my partner, and what I know. I think as I started dating, one of the biggest things for me was to know that my partner would be interested in continual growth. That if there was anything that felt stagnant, a challenge, an attachment fracture, kind of a rupture in our relationship, that was allowed to stay, would almost be a red flag for me. And I wouldn't really, that doesn't really feel like a good idea to me. Someone who melds with my family really well. As a Latino person, family is a huge component of the way that I see the world and the way that I swim through the world. So having Joe assimilate with, and not just match my family, but he just feels so much like home, like he always kind of belonged. I don't know how to describe that any other way. And then I think I need one more. I'm going to do a list of 3. Let's see. Common interests come to mind, but I think there's something about the way I feel when I'm around Joe that I have never experienced with anybody else. It's kind of like, I feel like I'm at home in my own body when I'm with him. And that to me feels priceless. So here are some ideas. Love the idea of being challenged. Thanks, coming from the comments. Time, definitely. Time let someone know, John, that you had the right partner. Craig, like about falling in love, companionship, for sure. Learning about the other, absolutely. That curiosity, I think, is really important. The joy I feel when I have fallen in love, absolutely, Luke, for sure. Eric, being deeply seen, being able to be vulnerable, deep and expansive, growing love. Awesome, love all of those answers. So if we continue, if you're seeing me look over here, I'm looking at my iPad so I can follow along on the guide to keep me oriented. I want to really say that if we assume that one sexual ethic works for all Christians, let alone all of humanity, we will deny very important pieces of our sexuality. And so we're definitely going to break that down tonight. I do want to allude to often the cultural conversation. I think that there's one camp that says monogamy, tradition, safety, and all of those things are important, but then we have this other very important camp that says now that we are sexually liberated and we get to have autonomy in our sex lives and our love lives, we get to express sex in whatever fashion. And I think that in the way that I've heard it, it almost sounds as though and sometimes even within progressive Christianity, that the more spiritually evolved you are, the more towards polyamory or open relationships you should grow, almost as though they're one and the same. Spiritual growth should liberate you into feeling comfortable with non-monogamy or polyamory. And that may be true, not here to step on any toes, but that doesn't have to be true for everybody. And so today is all about deconstructing the shame around some of those conversations in terms of, I don't fit into the queer community, or maybe I should try on a sexual expression that really doesn't feel good internally. And so we're going to break down all of the nuances today about that. So before we do, I know this might sound really weird, but I want you to revisit your list of 3 things if you wrote them down, and I want you to cross off 2 from each category. It doesn't matter which 2, I just want you to take a pencil or a pen and just rip through them and cross 2 off. This always feels awkward for people. In the chats, I don't necessarily want you to tell me which ones you crossed off, but let me know what it felt like to cross them off. Anybody want to share what it feels like? Yeah, I agree, Brent. As the former ED of Q Christian Fellowship, I think I can do this, but Brent says, oh shit. It feels difficult to encompass my values in one statement. That's very true. And yes, Brent did say it for the recording. Oh, that's interesting. One person down here is saying, I tried to see if the 3 that were left had any connection to each other. Are you saying, Dan, maybe like a subconscious way of protecting yourself, maybe? Is that what it kind of was? Laura, thank you. It feels like a part of me is invisible when I take out some of them. Absolutely. Laura, I think what you're saying here, this is kind of the whole point of today's conversation, today's breakout. It's this idea that if there's a whole part of you that feels like it's being invisible when you take out other parts, I want to be very mindful of that, specifically when it has to do with sex, sexuality, and sexual ethics. I don't want any part of anybody to be left out, especially after the journey of coming out in a Christian environment, where parts of you are left hidden because of any sort of narrative, whether that be a religious, dogmatic Christian narrative, whether that be a cultural narrative of any kind that says no sex before marriage, or definitely polyamory, that sort of thing. So I really want to break this down today. Someone else said it feels like losing, maybe giving up part of myself. Absolutely. I will share a little story here. There was kind of this whole season in my relationship journey, where non-monogamy and polyamory started to come onto the surface. And so I found a therapist and we talked this out, and I said, is there my question was, because I'm evolving spiritually and feeling more and more liberated, do I have to somehow update the way that I experience and engage sex? And the more that I tried to lean into different expressions, the more it felt like I was leaving out parts of who I was. Now, that could be said in the opposite, to go from a conservative Christian environment, like many of us did, to maybe more of a progressive Christian environment, that maybe, if that's your story, to a place where you felt like polyamory or non-monogamy was actually healthy for you, then leaving out the polyamorous part of who you are could feel even just as stifling for other people. And so this is why I wanted to call this a sexual ethics spectrum, to find where you live kind of on that, that spectrum. Sorry, lost my words there for a second. Dan says, I don't think it was self-protection. I crossed off the first 2 in each category. And when I was left with 1 in each category, thought, is this enough to get by in a relationship? I love that, Dan. I think all of you are hinting at the one very specific reason that we're talking about this today. So let's dive in. If you go to page 2 in the diagram, and if anybody doesn't have access to it, put it in the chart and I'll screen share, and then we can all look at the same thing. I don't want anybody to be missing out. And it's very easy for me to share my screen, so please let me know. On page 2, where we set the context, I definitely will share the screen. You got it. On page 2, I want to look at this chart here. Before we do, let me set the context. The limbic system is a whole network. Some researchers are calling it the subcortical nuclei because it's made of different regions in the brain. But we know that the limbic system plays a huge role. It houses trauma, stress, anxiety, and oddly enough, safety. If we look at what the limbic system is doing, it's kind of like this emotional sponge that gathers all of this emotional information. And then when we hit REM sleep, it's all of that information. It's almost like REM sleep squeezes that sponge, and all of that data goes into the fascia. A lot of research right now is showing us that trauma lives in the shoulder blades and in the quads. And so our bodies are capable of holding memory outside of the brain. And this is because of the work of the limbic system. I want to kind of set up one really important example. If we look at monozygotic twins, so one egg, it was fertilized, mitosis, it's split into 2, so now we have 2 identical twins. These twins, let's say they live through a car accident. One of them comes out feeling completely fine, and the other one comes out demonstrating symptoms of trauma, anxiety, flashbacks, nightmares, those sorts of things. The one difference in a brain that is identically the same is one twin, the one with the trauma symptoms, will demonstrate a sensation of feeling powerless in the experience, whereas the twin that walked away experiencing no trauma actually interpreted themselves as having power in the experience. So perception plays a major role in what's happening in the limbic system. I'm going to tie this in later because our perception around sex and sexuality and our role in sex is going to have a really big impact in today's conversation and in the way that you create your own sexual ethic. So basically what I'm trying to say here is the body will respond differently for different people when it comes to sexual arousal as well. This is why saying one sexual ethic will work for everybody. Or if we journey spiritually, we will all land up in agreement on what is best for us sexually. And I kind of want to debunk that and really dive into that. So here in the bold, the same system that houses trauma, emotional information, and our ability to comfort ourselves is the same system that houses sexual functioning, the sexual experience, the interpretation of sex, how we feel there, and the perception of the sex context. Am I safe with my partner? Does my partner love me? Do they cherish me, my body? Do they enjoy my body? So forth and so on. So if we look at this really influential chart, and I don't have copies of it, this is the one that I have from years ago, and you can see it's all crinkly and stained, but it's cherished, so I photographed it. This is a chart that comes from the dissertation of a man named Peter Levine several years ago. Peter Levine is one of the world's leading experts in trauma. And in his dissertation, again, many moons ago, he created this chart to describe what's happening in the limbic system. I'm going to introduce you to some new language. The autonomic nervous system is what we're going to talk about today. And the autonomic nervous system has 2 branches. One is what we call fight, flight, or freeze. We call it sympathetic nervous system. So it's in charge of dilating our pupils, shutting off saliva production, shutting off the digestive system. It's in charge of pumping epinephrine, cortisol, adrenaline into our bloodstream. It expands our blood vessels. It increases our heart rate, all so that we can fight, flight, and get away from a predator that's chasing us in the wilderness. It's kind of classic example. The other branch of the autonomic nervous system is called parasympathetic, which we call cool, calm, and collected. It's in charge of shutting off all of those responses and putting the body back into comfortable or homeostasis, a heart rate that's regular, pupils that aren't dilated, a body that does not need to run, but a body that should be ready to rest and recuperate. So here we're looking at this really important red line in the chart and kind of this persistent black line that looks like an axis. So the persistent black line is the time that a stressor stays on. The longer the stressor stays on, the more activation we get in our autonomic nervous system. So the longer a stress stays, the higher and higher we climb into fight, flight, or freeze. At the top of this is where a lot of us experience rage or panic. This is when we're in fight, flight, or freeze, where you see number 2. At this point, I want you to think of a bunny rabbit that's running away from a predator, let's say a lion. That bunny, in all of its fight, flight, or freeze, it only has enough glucose, enough adenosine triphosphate, whatever it is, enough energy to run, and then the body runs out of energy, literally. That bunny will stop, and because it has no more energy to keep it in fight, flight, or freeze, the body's only choice then is to fall back down into cool, calm, and collected. If the stressor is still there and the predator is still approaching this poor little rabbit, this is where we see the trauma response turn on in sections number 3, and then disassociation in number 4. So this chart is really important because this is, again, this is not only the process of what happens during trauma, but this is the same apparatus in the body that makes sex and our sexual orgasm possible. So let's take a look at that. So when we're not running in fight, flight, or freeze mode, but we're actually having fun sexually, our bodies need to do kind of this wave, if you will. I call it the tilted Z. You can call it whatever you want, but it's kind of this downward thrust or fall, this upward thrust, and then back down into this gorgeous fall of cool, calm, and collected. The important thing to know about this chart is that we have to experience cool, calm, and collected first. The parasympathetic nervous system has to activate first. So we're experiencing safety, sensuality, care, titillation. Then once the body has reached this low point of feeling safe and soothed, then sympathetic, which is also known as fight, flight, or freeze, will shoot us up, our heart rate increases, and we can experience an orgasm. And this is what I call fawn. So it's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Once the orgasm is done, the body says, okay, now I get to relax with all these beautiful hormones flowing through my body. I feel safe, and we go back down into the central place. This, it's really important to know that this is the perfect way, if you will, the ideal way that the body should activate, or let me start over, that the body should deactivate, activate, and deactivate during sex. But because the sex apparatus shares its territory with trauma, anger, and anxiety, that will make this process really difficult for some of us. And I'm going to talk about that because this will all lead to our sexual ethic. I'm going to stop screen sharing real quick. I'm going to pop over to the chat just so we can see. You can't access files, showing the second page. Okay, I'll just keep sharing. Does anybody have any questions about this? Yes, there is someone here saying it is, okay, it's just to me, so I won't say it out loud. But this is, if anybody does have a challenge in terms of experiencing an orgasm, this is what we want to look at. We want to look at what's happening here, and we're going to dive into that today because I want to be holistic so you can create a really good sexual ethic for yourself. So someone is asking, is sex based off of trauma? Absolutely not. It's basically saying that in the way our bodies are constructed, maybe even if you believe in the way that God created us, it's almost like saying, I'm going to create one system that has two functions. So this one system that will help protect the body, but also this other system that will give the body this beautiful whoosh of pleasure. And so sex and trauma aren't necessarily working together. It's just the one apparatus that hosts both of them. Okay, I will keep going on. Any other questions before I do? I realize it takes a second to type, but okay, I'll come back to the questions. Okay. So one of the biggest words that we want to think about in terms of understanding our sexuality is safety. Safety plays a major role, whether that be physical safety, knowing that you're in a place that feels right, you've given consent, your partner or partners have given consent, but also, and this is a more subconscious part, and this is really what I want to talk about today, although consent is very important, emotional safety, relational safety. Oftentimes I have couples who come into the office saying, Isaac, I think I need to go on Viagra. I can't hold an erection anymore. What do I do? And of course, we can get medical professionals involved and get a prescription written. Or we can also, and this is my job, is to do an assessment on what's happening relationally within the relationship. Oftentimes what I find is the partner who cannot maintain an erection is holding major resentment. They feel incredibly lonely or isolated. They feel like they've been compromising, like the relationship is a one-way street. They're not experiencing a lot of give and take. And in that way, the body can't do its thing. And so, and we'll get to a chart for that. But I would really want you to pay attention to the idea of safety in a myriad of ways, not only physically, but also relationally, emotionally, maybe even for you spiritually or intellectually. So we want to pay attention to that. So I have here example number 1. And the point of this is to show, I want to juxtapose that there is all of our autonomic nervous systems are different. They all function differently. If I drive down the highway at 100 miles an hour, if I'm in Germany and I was raised in that culture and driving on the Autobahn and going 100 kilometers an hour, which is, 140 kilometers an hour, whatever, that might be normal to me. So I'm not going to get a lot of fight, flight, or freeze activity. But if I came from a small town like Brighton, Colorado, and you make me drive 100 miles on the highway, I might have a lot of activation in my fight, flight, or freeze. And so we want to be mindful that that's actually happening as well in our sexuality. Everybody's autonomic nervous system is going to produce different waves, and it will respond differently to different stimuli. So I want to compare example number 1 to example number 2, where we see a lot more of a dip, a lot more rigid activation, as opposed to example number 1, where we see a lot of more flat rolling heels, if you will. The one thing that I put in these charts that I didn't in the other is this little phrase down under parasympathetic that says the safety slide. That safety slide is going to have the spotlight for us today in our conversation, because this will be a determining factor, at least one of them, in the way that you construct your sexual ethic. I think that, well, we'll unpack this a little bit more, but I just wanted to hammer that out. So I want you to take a moment and maybe share as you're comfortable. And if you are, you can just talk to me personally or to everyone in the group. But how was sex, safety, and sensuality set up for you from the beginning? How did you interpret the lessons that you heard around safety, sex, and sensuality, excuse me? Because this will play a really big and important role. If you were to rewind to, I don't know, 1988, when I was 5 years old, you would have heard a lot of purity culture, a lot of shame around nudity, a lot of talk about one man, one woman, no sex before marriage. And so being exposed to more sexual content as I got older, it all went through that filter. And so my interpretation wrapped a lot of shame, a lot of boundaries, maybe too many boundaries around this idea of sex. Whereas for my partner, Joe, one of the first talks he had with his dad, they were in hot springs and everybody was naked. And It was very open and very welcomed, and the innocence of the human body was talked about and appreciated. And so my partner Joe got a very different introduction. And so the interpretation that we wrap around sex will be part of the information in that emotional sponge. It will be part of the context within which we engage sexuality internally. So in my example, in my limbic system, this emotional sponge, there might have been a lot more shame wrapped around sex, whereas for Joe, a lot more shamelessness. And that will predict the way that I flow through the autonomic nervous system. My tilted Z might look very different than Joe's. And so I want to consider that as well as we create our sexual ethic. So I maybe just take a couple moments and write down some thoughts about what your interpretations of sex and sexuality were, where you heard them, and maybe which ones persist even still today. I think it's really important as you do that. I'll just kind of keep us rolling here. I'll stay in the same area, so I'm not going to venture out, but so you can have some time to jot down some of your thoughts. But I think one of the biggest things that I hear as a clinician, and I used to experience, was a whoosh of guilt right after experiencing an orgasm. A lot of clients will say, Isaac, right when I have an orgasm, I experience an incredible sense of guilt, like I've just done something wrong, like I am something wrong. What is that about? This is how trauma, shame, anxiety can sneak its way into the sex experience, not because it's introducing something, but because if you think about it this way, as we're chugging along through this autonomic pipe, if you will, we're going to hit some of the residue that's been lodged in this pipe. Some of that old information, some of that anxiety is still sitting there like gunk in this pipe, and we're going to hit it every time. This is why a little bit of a trigger warning, those of us who have experienced a sexual assault, when we're in the sex moment, our trauma will be triggered. And that makes perfect sense because we're using the same apparatus. I'm going to pop over to the chats here and let's see what's going on. Okay. Oh, some good ones. I'm going to go back. Okay. Give me a moment while I find my place here. Okay. Sorry, I'm weeding through, making sure I don't reread something twice. One person is saying that they didn't get much of a sexual talk, and I think that that's really, really important. And one of the reasons why I feel so passionate about this conversation, and I always say it this way, it's a little campy, but a lot of straight people got the birds and the bees talk, but not many of us got the bees and the bees or the birds and the birds talk. And that is a very different talk. I think had my father or anybody had sat me down and said, Isaac, the fact that you crave love and you're oriented to find someone who loves you is so sweet and beautiful. And when that lover touches your body and introduces you to sensuality, it will be an extension, an expression, a symbol of how loved you are. I would have understood the experience of my own sexuality very interesting. And I think it's important for us to kind of maybe play around with that kind of narrative as a way of reparenting ourselves, but also as a way of recategorizing sex in our own emotional buckets. Can we put it out? Can we pluck it out of the dirty bucket and put it into the clean bucket? I think is a really important process for us to do. I wish I could spend time talking about how we do that. And if we have time at the end, I will. But yes, I think there is now more than ever, thank goodness, we have incredible ways of treating trauma. We have somatic experiencing by Peter Levine. the amazing work of Bessel van der Kolk, EMDR with Francis Shapiro. A lot of people are starting to use psychedelics in trauma work. So if there is trauma in your history, there's a lot of options. You can always email me and I can direct you to someone who can really help, because I know that's a very important topic when we're considering sex and sexuality. Okay, yes, I'm just reading through these. Okay, I'm going to, if you want me to answer a question, I love that y'all are communicating, but if you have a question for me, put it in the Q&A and then I'll know just to look there. I'm glad that you all are communicating this much, but I can't read through all of them quite yet. So I'll read the next question. While I have relatively healthy look at sex, I feel an urge to keep some kinks or less vanilla sex more secret or less open about, especially as a minister. I'm still letting perceived perceptions and judgments tell me what is okay. You know, I think that that's a very, very common experience. Again, because our limbic systems are holding on to all of this sponge, all of this activity. And I think that that is very normal. The one thing that really helped me to kind of clean out that pipe, if you will, was EMDR and trauma treatment with psychedelics. That was super, super life transformative for me. And it's common, but hopefully today, as we continue on, hopefully we can even continue to unravel some of that shame in some of the things that are coming up. So how do we get out of a trauma-based mindset to an actual lovely sexual experience? Again, I think this, in my experience, because trauma is so capable of literally integrating into your body, I would seek out a trauma therapist who can help you dismantle some of the trauma triggers that you might experience during a sexual experience. I wish there was a way that we could just power through, but because trauma literally forms peptides and those peptides live in our fascia, we have to have someone dismantle them professionally. I have a YouTube video, it's called Titration. It's on our iAmClinic channel. Titration is a great way of processing traumatic content in the body right in the here and now. I also think this falls in line with the consent part of our sexual ethic. As much as is appropriate, I think, and if you're not, there's so many caveats here, but one way is to talk openly with the sexual partner if they're trustworthy and safe, how they will keep you safe, specifically if you have a trauma trigger during a sexual experience, will be really, really helpful. We'll talk about consent here going down the road. One person is asking, I'm curious whether you're going to discuss casual sex and hookups as part of our sexual spiritual liberation. I've moved past a lot of shame surrounding hookups, but I still feel confused about whether there's room for this in a Christian sexual ethic. I absolutely think that there is room for this in a Christian sexual ethic, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I really love answering this question. And if you're the person who has this question and I don't hit the nail on the head later on, let me know and I'll dive more deep into your question. There's another question. What about getting comfortable with self-pleasure? I do experience some guilt afterwards, and I have even gotten to a point where it's not even something I want. Yes, absolutely. Let me I'm gonna go on a little bit of a side tangent here. One of the more important pieces, again, safety, and sometimes we cannot experience the safety we need because of internalized transphobia, internalized homophobia, but even sometimes dysphoria or dysmorphia. And so I think that in order to make peace with some of our sexuality, we first have to make peace with some of our emotionality. because that is going to be the basis of everything sexual. If the whole point of the sex is to first experience safety, we not only have to feel safe with someone else and not only safe within our body, but we have to feel that the emotional experiences we have during sex are also safe experiences for us to have. I remember the first time I had ever done anything with someone of the same gender. We were sitting on his couch and we were making out, and I felt this incredible liberation, almost like this bird had been released from a cage. And at the very minute that ended and I walked away, I felt so dirty. I literally was flooded with shame. The reason, and here's the more important part, the physical acts that I had just done, the making out, they assimilated with my shame. So I blamed the physical experience as the reason for my experience of shame. And after studying this and kind of living in this world for so long, I realized that underneath those two clusters is the emotional experience. Again, internalized homophobia says, Isaac, what you're doing with this man is wrong. But had I been liberated from the shame, I might have said, this is beautiful, it is innocent, it is great pleasure. And then my body could have assimilated that as an experience of joy, innocence, and pleasure. So I really think that our emotionality is so super important, and we want to make sure that that's clean. Again, if there's any trouble or discomfort around self-pleasure and masturbation, I think that we want to look at the emotional cravings that are happening. Let me unpack that a little bit more. I almost said this once at our sexual panel. So if you watched the sexual panel at Q Christian when we were in Denver, I started this metaphor and then I never finished it, but I will finish it today. If I am craving chocolate chip cookies, I can go to the panel and I can get the flour, the vanilla, the chocolate chips, and go to the fridge and get the eggs. I can whip them together, put them on the pan, bake them, and then I created my own pleasure. And I get to say in that moment, I am autonomous, I'm independent, and I can create what is pleasurable for me. However, if my mom came in and shamed the joy of cookies, too many calories, Isaac, you're gonna blah, 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 gain weight, or I'm just making up this narrative. My experience of creating those chocolate chip cookies and enjoying them is going to feel very bad. And so when we're talking about sexuality and we're making our own pleasure, we're self-pleasuring, we want to look at the cravings that drove us there. Was I trying to soothe myself? Was I playing a fantasy in my head of belonging? Oftentimes it's to feel powerful. And if I were to talk with my nephew who said, Uncle Isaac, I want to feel powerful today, I would never in a million years say, Jackson, that is a dirty thing to want. I would say, Jackson, that is a beautiful, innocent craving. Let's go find power. How can we activate this for you today? Totally unrelated to sex. This craving for power is beautiful. Now let's take that into sexuality. When I'm driving towards self-pleasure, what are the cravings driving me in that direction? And can I experience them as good, clean, and innocent? And that will help us in our experience of self-pleasure. Okay. Yes. Okay. What about porn? Porn involves some other portions of the brain, and I think it's really important. Porn, when we're engaged in porn, our body is doing a couple of different things. We're getting a dopamine release that we don't really see in any, we get an elevated dopamine release, which is beyond the normal threshold. So when we're looking at porn, our brain is actually calibrating to a higher whoosh, a higher rush of excitement and pleasure. And then it's hard to experience that same level of pleasure without porn. So we want to be a little cautious around those of us who have more of an addictive personality, because porn, there's actually kind of a biochemical setup that allows porn to recalibrate our central nervous system. So we want to be a little cautious about that. If you have more questions, you can email me and we can kind of talk through that. Isaac at iamclinic.org. So yeah, okay. I'm gonna hop back in and let's keep moving in our discussion. Okay. So here we have the context. We're looking at how your nervous system responds to safety and what that means. I think one other important factor when we're talking about the context to create our sexual ethic is the way that emotions will produce attraction and arousal. I have a story. When my first boyfriend introduced himself to me, I thought he was one of the most kind people on the planet, and he was attractive. But the more I got to know him, the more attractive he became to me. And so here on this gender spectrum, I created this to maybe mimic what a bi person's experience might look like. So on the spectrum, for me, if people born in male bodies or male presenting or whatever were on the left side, I would have more of an emotional reaction to those genders. And as a pan person, for someone born in a female presenting body, my emotional reaction isn't as big. But that emotional reaction is very important. So I would say from my experience that I can be both pan and demi at the same time, because the pan part drives me towards a particular gender and the demi part expands the way that I experience attraction and arousal with that particular gender. And so I kind of want to introduce that mechanism for you too, that emotions can play a big part. Okay, so just some musings on demi. You can kind of think about that. Here, I want to talk a little bit about these little bubbles. I know this is a lot of dense information, but hang in there with me. We're getting somewhere. Let me see, 4:30, 5:30. We're done at 6, correct? Yes, okay, so we got 45 minutes, okay. If you look at this little graph, I'm not a graphic designer, so please bear with my graphics, but these little blue bubbles that I put here, this is what I might call a critical period, because this is the moment, we're getting these hormonal releases all the time, but if we pretended just for a moment that it happened when we were in parasympathetic nervous system, when we're in this lull of safety and sensuality and our bodies are being tickled and pleasured and held, and we're sliding down into that safety slide, we're about to have an orgasm, we're experiencing a type of safety for some of us where this emotional bonding can happen. And I don't want to forget about these critical periods because they will influence what we do in our sexual ethic. That bonding plays a very important role for some of us. It doesn't for everybody because not everybody has this critical period in their experience. But for some of us, it is a thing. So we're going to kind of look at that. You'll see here, example number 1, the bubble is kind of narrow and thin, but here it's consuming, it's bigger, it's holding a lot more. And I want to just talk about that what happens in these critical periods, it's determined by our attachment style from early on, our propensity for depression and anxiety, any trauma of any kind, our perceptions of safety, relationally and physically, our neuroanatomy. So what's happening, what are the shapes of the different sizes, or excuse me, what are the sizes of different regions of the brain that produce this emotional reaction, emotional bonding, connectedness, and then any substance use. We want to be really careful because any substance use will not only impair the autonomic nervous system's ability to perform, but it might also help you violate some of your own boundaries. So we might want to think about, as you're creating your own sexual ethic, how might substance use be a part of that ethic or not? So that's really important. So here we have experience number one, and I'm talking here just very stereotypically using very blanket statements. And I know this is very nuanced, but it's an easier way to talk about this. So let's say that up here in experience number one, sorry, I'm going to go back up here, this kind of more flat, rolling hills, less endorphins, less bonding emotion, that this person is using sex as a way, or engaging sex as a way to experience pleasure. They have an autonomic nervous system that is stabilized without little need for signs of safety, or they can create this internal sense of safety within themselves. They might be someone with more certitude, someone who's just kind of more mentally prone for strong independence. This person might have an interpretation or a perception of safety, sex, and nudity that doesn't require external proof of being okay. And we can say that this person experiences less emotional engagement or less of an emotional response during sex. Let's use stereotypes here. Let's say that this person can experience polyamory in a way that doesn't provoke guilt or shame, and it doesn't leave them feeling powerless in the situation. They might walk away feeling shamelessness, innocence. They might walk away feeling clean. And that's all because their autonomic nervous system is doing something very different, especially compared to someone like example number two, this deep slide, this deep safety slide, this incredible emotional experience. This person might be using sex or experiencing sex in a very different way. I like this quote. I came up with it years ago, but it helps me articulate one really important thing. For people who have experience number two in general, the primary role of sexual orientation is not to tell you whose body you'll enjoy. It is to guide you toward the life-changing love you most deeply crave. This is true for many people, but definitely not for all people. What I'm really kind of getting at here is the idea that because safety is such an important part of the sex and our sexual ethic, we have to look at what comes before the safety. So if we really focus in on this, a lot of times one person's, let's take for example, my autonomic nervous system needs to experience an emotional safety, an intellectual safety, definitely safety around consent. And because I have that safety, now I'm experiencing this incredible emotional reaction of bonding and connectedness that I think we read about in the Psalms and that a lot of people talk about in Christian spaces. And that bonding feels reinforced as I go through the sexual experience. This is just my autonomic nervous system, but that experience informs the ethic that I might hold for my sex life, as opposed to someone whose autonomic nervous system is just doing something different. It's not worse, it's not better, it's just different. And so this is why I think casual hookups and using sex casually can still be ethical, because it's your version of safety and what role sex plays in your body and in the way you interpret what's happening. I think it was really unfair for a lot of people if we were going to rewind to the 1950s and say the only sexual ethic is between one man and one woman and sex can only happen after marriage. We were denying a lot of truth in a lot of people's bodies. And I think we want to just think really strategically around what's happening. There are some really big caveats here, and we'll get to those here in a little bit. Right now, actually, it's a good segue. I didn't realize it was coming so soon. Okay, so I'm going to read a question in the box here. Okay, so this question is basically saying, for those of us who are bi, is there a different experience in the brain that's happening This is a really good question. And as far as I know, there is no difference in the brain happening. Where our bodies are, let me describe this differently. Rationally speaking, we know that you might be sleeping with someone in a male body or someone in a female body or a trans person or whatever it might be. The rational centers in the brain that understand which gender you're sleeping with are totally disconnected from the autonomic nervous system. This is why trauma, anxiety are so irrational, because they're literally anatomically disconnected from the rational cortex in the brain. I'm guessing here, so I'm answering your question with all of the information that I have. But because of that distance in the brain, those two regions in the brain and their distance from each other and their lack of communicating with each other, I would assume that there is no different reaction in the brain, specifically because the autonomic nervous system is going to respond to subconscious information like touch, arousal, and it's not really based on I don't think that the brain would experience anything. I do think the brain will respond differently if you feel uncomfortable, because if there's any component of the sex experience that leaves you feeling uncomfortable, the body will do something different. And so I think that's where, or discomfort or powerlessness, I think those are the two things that would make the experience different. So I hope I answered your question. If I didn't, let me know. Let's see, what else do we have? This is a good question. How would these models look different when we experience different multiple orgasms? That's a really good question. If you're experiencing multiple orgasms, it just depends. You can kind of have your safety slide and then orgasm and fall and kind of experience this maybe smaller wave until you crash into parasympathetic nervous system again. For people who have more of a rebound phase, they might have these more deeper waves in between orgasm. And so it just depends on how spread apart the orgasms are. I would imagine if you're experiencing them pretty consistently one after another, you're probably staying in sympathetic nervous system. So in other words, you're probably staying in fight, flight, or freeze longer. Okay. So I want to throw out the ways that, just like we can abuse alcohol, I want to talk about the ways we can subconsciously or maybe even consciously abuse sex. So there's something really important when we're talking about attachment and relationships, and it's called negative control. Negative control is a way of taking control in a negative way. Pretty self-explanatory. I like to think of negative control, and if you were in my workshop earlier today, we talked about this, but if you think of negative control as a poker, and if I need something out of someone, affirmation, touch, to feel beautiful, to feel sexy, whatever it might be, I can get my negative control poker out and I can provoke them into soothing me the way that I want. So something like, babe, do you love me? The only answer is yes, babe, I love you. That is a way of provoking someone into soothing us. And I think, I'm going to caveat or put a disclaimer here. I don't think that hookup apps are all wrong and all bad, and hooking up, I definitely don't think that that's wrong and bad, depending on your sexual ethic. But oftentimes dating apps and hookup apps are full of negative control. If I can curate the perfect body and take the perfect photo and post it on this app, it's my way of poking other people into telling me I'm beautiful. And if they want me even to go over to their house, then I know that I'm beautiful, fill in the blank. Then I know I'm strong, I'm sexy, I'm good looking, I'm wanted, I'm valuable. I want to keep using that descriptive language because those are the primary emotions. Again, if someone said, Isaac, I'm about to download Grindr because I want to know that I'm valuable, I want to feel sexy, I wouldn't necessarily pay attention to the downloading or what they were going to do, but more about a way of soothing that craving in a way that leaves them feeling clean and innocent rather than manipulative and shamed. So I want to think about the ways that we use negative control and make sure that our sexual ethic doesn't include that. Here's why. Another reason. Negative control will always shoot you in the foot. It's a perfect way of saying they only want me because I can make that picture happen. They only want me because of this facet of who I am. And if I let that slide, they won't want me anymore. And so our sexual ethic is contingent upon how we present ourselves rather than who we are authentically. And I think that's really, really important. Okay, no questions there. Just pop them in the box if you have any. We got half an hour to go. I'm going to try and wrap this up so we can have time for more Q&A if you guys have anything come up. Sex as a seduction bomb. Seduction bombs, they're attempts to get the attention or the affirmation or the belonging for someone by kind of peppering them with this spectacular experience. It might be experiencing that you're on the brink of a breakup. So you disrobe and you put on a trench coat and you drive over to your partner's home. And when they open the door, you flash them and you have this incredible sexual experience that feels like bonding. Sometimes we can use that seduction bomb it comes out of a motivation of fear rather than a motivation to create something that leaves you, again, feeling innocent, clean, and proud, very shameless. So if seduction bombs are part of the way that you engage or express your sexuality, we might want to look at what is the deeper pain under there, what emotion isn't being satisfied, the connection, the belonging. And if we can work on that, then we have a really good chance of putting your sexual ethic into practice in a way that leaves you feeling really proud of yourself. This next point I feel really passionate about. I wish that we had different language. I love the idea and the nomenclature, the naming of sexual orientation. I think it would have been way more helpful if we came out as relational beings having a relational orientation as opposed to a sexual orientation. Here's maybe the difference. When I come out as gay, it means this is what I want to do sexually. If I were to come out as a relational being, it would say, this is where my love is activated more fully, more holistically, more innocently. And when that love is expressed between the two of us, we do certain things in the bedroom. But I think the whole narrative of seeing ourselves as relational beings allows us to prioritize the mechanisms of connectedness rather than the offspring, the offshoots, the side effects, it's the word I'm looking for, the expression of our connection. And so I think that I want to, as you're crafting your own sexual ethic, I think it might be important to start with who are you as someone with a relational orientation? What are you oriented to relationally? Because that's going to help set you up for how you express your sexuality. Does anybody have questions there? Some are popping up here, so I'll go there. I have not written any of this in a form or a book, so all we have is this recording. But if you want more, we can always connect over Zoom or coffee if you're in the Denver area or whatever. So I'm working on it, but not quite yet. So is negative control like reassurance seeking? Yes, it absolutely is. Just having sex with someone to get them to fill a specific need makes us feel worthy. Sometimes, absolutely. Sometimes, I remember when I was 23 and Grindr was just a brand new thing, and I was sitting in my small little one-bedroom apartment with mice running all around. It was really horrible. But I remember just feeling so utterly lonely. But because of the loneliness, I also felt valueless. No one wanted me. And so I would download Grindr, and I remember hating it so much because I was so full of internalized homophobia, but also so excited to prove to myself through Grindr and someone else's affirmation that I wasn't valueless. And if I went through a hookup, the negative control would shoot me in the foot because it would be over, he would be gone, I would be back in my apartment feeling even more lonely. And so the negative control that I was using was coming out of a place of fear and desperation. And so I had to go through with the sexual act in order to soothe that pain, even though the soothing was very temporary. So I don't want to diminish or discredit or paint hookups and grinders completely bad, but we can use them in a way that leaves us feeling very shamed. Do you have any suggestions on how to deal with having a partner where you have different sexual ethics? Yes, for sure. For example, one person who is into hookups, not well in a relationship and sex before marriage, but the other would like to wait until marriage, or at least until there's a strong emotional romantic connection. Absolutely. I think that we'll get to this a little bit more, but the consent process is really, really, really important. And we want to make sure that the contract between these two people is really clean. And we'll get into this, but the contract shouldn't only be about what you do physically and what you don't do physically, but also what you do and don't do emotionally. Because again, if the partner who's more oriented towards the strong emotional connection and they don't feel safe with their partner because they might be out hooking up, that lack of safety will shift the trajectory of the sexual experience. I have a little graphic that we'll look at that will help explain this a little bit more. Are there key principles that should guide our sexual ethic? Yes. I definitely think that some of the key principles are making sure that there is safety in all of the paradigms that are really important. Physical safety, emotional safety, intellectual safety, social safety, and spiritual safety. When we have all of those in place and we know how our body responds, then I think, and what I mean by that is, do I experience a deep emotional experience during sex? And if not, that kind of points me over here. But if I do, that points me over here. So having a really clear understanding of what's happening for you kind of during this tilted Z process is a really key component to understand, because that's going to predicate a lot of alignment. If you're not someone who needs a lot of safety and sex is more about recreation and pleasure, to find other sexual partners who experience that could make this a little bit, I don't know, maybe more clean or easy, a little bit more of a good match, as opposed to someone who is experiencing this deep emotional experience. And so bonding is happening one way, but not the other way during sex. And that off-kiltered setup really needs a lot of clear communications. Those would be some of the key components that I would talk about for sure. How would the relational concept work with those of us who have different sexual or and romantic orientations? Do you mind giving me a little bit more? Just kind of fleshing that out for me. How would the relational concept work with those of us who have different sexual and romantic orientations? I think, again, I don't know if I'm really understanding your question. I'm sorry. Give me a little bit more and then I'll definitely want to answer you. This is a great question. How would seeking affirmation and reassurance in a positive way look as opposed to negative control? This is a really good question. The whole premise behind negative control is believing that I'm not valuable enough to blatantly ask for what I want. So in the context where I feel valueless, my only option is to poke it out of someone. So when we want to do this in a positive way, it looks like just asking for what you want. Something like, hey babe, today I'm feeling really lonely. and I have this little narrative playing in my head that you don't love me. I want you to know that this is my experience. But I wanted to talk to you about this because I would really like to feel close with you. Do you mind if we Netflix and chill tonight? I would really like to just be by your side. Getting an answer from a healthy partner would bring that reassurance and that affirmation that you're really looking for. So remember, negative control, we use it when we don't know that we're valuable enough to ask for what we want. I've started dating someone recently. Oh, this is a good question. I started dating someone recently and I struggle with virtual sex or nudes. What would be your suggestions? I could go in two different ways. If there's pressure being put on you to produce naked pics and you don't want to, I definitely would suggest having a conversation around consent. And beyond that, for your partner, what would the nudes bring? A sense of excitement, a sense of titillation, feeling special that only you are producing pictures for them. And if that's the case, then I would talk about those emotions and how to get that excitement, the titillation, and feeling special, how to get those needs met in a different way. If this is though you're excited about sending nude pics and this is a new experience for you, this might be a great place to talk about that contract. If I send these to you, what do you do with the photos? Physically, do you delete them off of your phone right away? Do you masturbate to them? What role do these photos play for you? I think another experience here, we talk about this in sex therapy a lot, but it's getting to know your body. And sometimes that means buying toys and in the privacy of your own room, getting to know what your body enjoys and how it responds. And in the same way, I think this could be another way of expanding your sexual expression in a way that should be in line with your sexual ethic. So if you need to practice taking nudes and having those really tough conversations before you send them, this could be a really fun way of both of you engaging in something that's really fun and kind of special just for the two of you. So I hope that answers your question. To clarify, okay, if someone is sexually attracted to one gender, but can still be romantically attracted to other genders. Ah, I got it, okay. Yes, okay, sexually attracted to one gender, but romantically attracted to another gender, yeah. So if someone is sexually attracted to one gender and romantically attracted to another gender, the relational concept there, I think, again, will just take a lot of clear communication. I think it would be really helpful to even talk about really fortifying the sense of safety and what that means, but also having fun with vulnerability. Who are you? What do you like? Because I would be really interested to see if in your sexual arousal, you might actually begin to experience attraction, either romantic or sexual attraction to the opposite gender. I don't know if that's possible. It definitely doesn't have to be. But if it didn't happen, you couldn't experience the romantic attraction to the gender that you were experiencing sexual attraction. I think that would require a clean contract and maybe even into some an open relationship or something, but again, with a very clean boundary that worked not only for you, but that also allowed the safety for your partner to stay intact, because that's going to be really, really, really important. Do I know of any resources that list the biblical scriptures that support polyamory? I do not. The one person who does speak on this that I know of, I believe Kevin Garcia might know, so you might want to connect with him. You can send him a message on WOVA. He's at the conference. Brandon Robertson is the other person that comes to mind. I definitely think he has resources on the scriptural basis for polyamory, but I'm sorry, I don't. How do we figure out what we enjoy emotionally, relationally, and religiously without crossing boundaries for ourselves? That may be subconscious. I love this question. I talked about this morning, so I apologize. Vulnerability. I think is a great way of figuring out what is arousing for you, even if it's intellectually or emotionally or sexually, step by step. So I experienced, or I talked about vulnerability as though we take a little chunk of something vulnerable. I'm afraid of snakes, or in my case, mice. So I take this little piece, this harmless piece of vulnerability, and I share it with someone trustworthy, and they take it and they cherish it, they assimilate it, and then they treat that part of me with respect. Then I say, great, A plus, now you get a bigger chunk. Now I'm going to hand over more vulnerability. They continue to do the same, they're consistent and trustworthy. Now I'm handing over bigger and bigger chunks, but with these bigger chunks, I'm traversing a new territory with them. So now I'm experiencing a vulnerability even to myself. I'm still safe with this person. Now, maybe sexually, I can experience this new thing. And if they cherish me and if I'm still safe, I'm now allowed to kind of integrate that into my sexual experience. And if there's something that we experienced with and it left me feeling unsafe, I need to assess that. Why did I feel unsafe? And will that lack of safety stay there forever and ever? And if the answer is yes, then we don't assimilate that into our sexual ethic. Okay, so I'm gonna pop back over to share my screen. So here we have a different chart, and I've referenced this a little bit, but if a little bit of a trigger warning here, I'm gonna just briefly touch on trauma, but not a lot. Trauma, anxiety, performance anxiety, especially if you feel like you have to be a great sexual partner. If sex is a test you must pass. Or on the flip side, same side of the coin, other side of the coin, if there's a healthy shamelessness, there's no feelings of shame around sex, this will all predicate how our body will respond. So in this chart, if there's no safety, if there's anger, resentment, lack of give and take in the relationship, or trauma, anxiety, depression, the parasympathetic nervous system can't do its job. And so the only thing that the autonomic nervous system can do is stay in sympathetic or fight, flight, or freeze. And it will disrupt your ability to experience physical arousal, an erection, if you're in a male body, and get to the fawn part, because the body's only option, if those things are present, is to go up into fight, flight, or freeze. And so we want to be really careful to stay away from shaming yourself if this is what's happening for you. Oftentimes, again, sometimes people with strong anxiety or anxiety disorders will come in and they'll say, Isaac, I couldn't get an erection. I was so anxious. And on one night, and then the next night, I had an erection, or I was totally aroused and I had this wonderful orgasm. And so now my partner is expecting that over and over again. But the pressure of that keeps me from experiencing arousal, what's happening. And basically the anxiety is kind of hijacking the autonomic nervous system. And it's just, the anxiety is forcing the body to stay in fight, flight, or freeze. And so the body, it just cannot produce the orgasm, or maybe even arousal. So that's something to pay attention to. So a sexual ethic then is about understanding the ingredients and the recipe to your sexual experience. What is your attachment style? We kind of talked about that this morning. So you can watch the YouTube videos when they post them at the end of the weekend. The role of emotions during sex and bonding during sex, any trauma that might be influencing, internalized phobias like biphobia, transphobia, or homophobia, your perception of sex. I had one young lady come into my office, and she waited until marriage, and she was in the dressing room after her wedding taking off her dress, and she started to cry because her new husband was in the room with her, and she said, I just felt so dirty. And so the perceptions that we have around sex, we really want to investigate those so it doesn't feel like we're doing something dirty when we're actually engaging something clean. And then the other thing that we obviously want to apply is our experiences of safety in all of those 5 domains: emotional, intellectual, spiritual, so forth and so on. Here are some really good questions that I suggest to my clients and friends, and even I still use them myself. Am I using sex and someone else's body to soothe a wound that leaves me feeling empty, inadequate, or isolated? Or is sex being used to leave me feeling more alive, clean, and respectful of my body and the other person's body? That might be a way of helping navigate through some of the complexities. Does your sexual ethic include consent between you and the other person? That is very, very, very important. Again, you might want to think about substance use as part of your sexual ethic. I include this because it's a really big part of my story. If sex was a form of negative control, if I can go to Trax, it's a popular dance club here. I was 22 and I would say, if I could drink enough and find the right guy, and if he wanted to take me home, I would always wake up feeling so shamed, but I needed the alcohol to get me to the place where I would be willing to go home with someone. And so in this lack of sexual ethic, I was using my body and using someone else's body and sex as a way of finding validation. And drinking was a really big component of that for me for many years. So if that is happening for you, or if drinking or substances are becoming an avenue for shame to leak themselves into your sexual ethic, I would really recommend kind of parsing through that and really thinking critically there. I mentioned this because we can break our own trust very, very easily. I remember after those nights of blacking out and waking up in someone's bed saying, like, what the F did I just do? I began to feel like there was a part of me that was my own perpetrator, that I was so broken and so powerless that this kind of monster inside of me would activate, and it would lead me into this place where I would wake up not knowing who I was with or how I got there. And that actually started to feel like trauma. I was having flashbacks, I couldn't sleep, I was experiencing depression and incredible anxiety. And so I just want to make sure that the breaking of your own trust could present itself as legitimate trauma. And so I want you to be aware of that as you're engaging your own sexuality, and to protect you from that, it might be helpful to put that into your sexual ethic, because that can be really, really painful. If shame is provoking shame, we want to talk about potentially about something in the past, a narrative that plays in your head that some person told you, or internalized homophobia. We want to be really careful about that. So here are some things that you can communicate with your partner or partners. And so I want you guys to have a really clean contract. I told you I would come here again. So in your contract, what do you do and what do you don't do physically with yourselves, or if you're polyamorous, what you do and don't do with other people? What do you do emotionally if you're in a couple or a triad or more than that? If you're polyamorous, and it might be in your contract that if you're starting to fall in love, you shut that relationship down. Or it might be in your contract that if you're falling in love, then you talk about it, and that's fine and beautiful. So I just want you to think about when you're creating your own ethic and living it out with one or more people, I want you to have serious conversations about what are the boundaries, not only physically, but emotionally, relationally, and rationally. I put this idea in here, but what concepts around sex stay in the ethical part for you? So I just wanted to add that little piece in here. Do you know your body, and do you take time to get to know theirs? I think if we think of ourselves as relational beings, having a sexual ethic is not only about expressing and engaging our sexuality healthily, but to be healthy, ethical beings, we need to make sure that we know we're respecting we're actually respecting someone else's body and giving them the safety to talk about what they need to talk about, so we know that we're not taking advantage of or causing unsafety in any passive way. So that's a part of my sexual ethic for sure. I think another big piece of our sexual ethic is the courage to protect your version of sexuality, no matter what your pastor or your parents or the queer culture says, that this gets to be about protecting your body, so that your actions and your sex life are in alignment with who you are, what you experience, and how your body is designed to react towards sex, because that's really important. I don't want anybody out there who loves the idea of bonding during sex in a monogamous relationship to be shamed by the narrative of polyamory, and vice versa. I don't want anybody who's polyamorous to be shamed by the narrative of monogamy. And so the added layer, of course, is to make sure that we're not in one of those camps because of negative control, or as a way of locking ourselves down. Whew. Okay, we have 5 minutes left. So flood the chat box. If you have any questions, now's the time. In instances where we break our own trust, what are ways that we rebuild that trust with ourselves? It's a good question. Trust is earned. So I definitely think the first thing that we need to do is to spend a lot of time watching ourselves live through the same trigger and respond differently. I think that's going to be really, really important. I think another facet that we want to make sure we do is uncover. I could spend months talking about shame and its effects and the way that it happens. But we want to make sure that when we break our own trust, we look at the innocent emotional craving that created the behavior. So again, if I'm lonely and I'm looking for connection, and this urge to feel connected to forces me to do something that really leaves me shamed, I don't want to pay attention to the thing I did. I want to pay attention to the frenetic sensation of wanting connection. And then I want to create that connection in a really, really healthy way. But I want to be really conscious about the thing that's subconscious. So we want to take it from the subconscious and put it into our consciousness and focus on it and make that a priority, so that we're nurturing that frenetic need for connection. We love to shame ourselves for what we do, even though underneath every single action is an innocent craving in my mind. Going all the way back, if we want to use the Bible, Psalms 138, I was, or God gives me the desires of my heart, and those desires can produce different behaviors, but we never want to focus on the behavior. We want to stick with the emotional reaction. I love the story of the woman at the well. I think it's a really cool story. This one woman walks up to Jesus and she has 5 husbands and a boyfriend, and Jesus says, "Hey, go get your boyfriend, or go get your husband and tell him what I'm about. Go, go get him and I'll talk to him." And then I don't know what she does, but Jesus is kind of like, "Aha, you don't have a husband. In fact, you have 5, and the man you're with right now is not your husband." And we can take this scripture almost as though Jesus was calling her out or chastising her, but I think Jesus was empathizing with her. I think he was saying, "Look, girl, you're thirsty. I have this water that'll never leave you thirsty again, but let's talk about why you're thirsty. You're here in the middle of the day all by yourself. You've got to be lonely. You're hungry for attention. You're looking for connection. You have all of these men who are providing that for you. And if you saw yourself the way that I see you, that would be the water that would never leave you thirsting again." And so I'm using the story to say we don't need to look at the 5 husbands and the behaviors and all the things that we do. We need to look at, are we connected to the innocence of who we are? Because when we're nurturing that and really taking care of that, what comes out of us will be really beautiful. We're down to a couple of seconds. I don't see anything in the Q&As. Oh, here's a, You guys are so welcome. Lots of thank yous. You are so welcome. I wish I could see you guys, but even just being here with y'all is so fun. Hopefully next year we can be with each other. And again, if you guys have any questions, if you need to ask anything, please feel free. You can email us here at the clinic if you need a therapist or a coach, info@iamclinic.org. If you just want to ask me some questions, you can always ask me, Isaac@iamclinic.org. And yes, thank you to the ASL team. Applause to them. Thank you so very much for doing this. Yeah, I love you guys so much. Take care. Bye.